public and private property. Having discussed the ownership of organizations, we return to a discussion of the ownership of assets like land, buildings, and machinery by organizations. We will use our theory of property to explain the difference between private and public ownership of a resource. Private and public externalities differ according to the number of affected people. Similarly, private and public ownership can be distinguished by the number of owners. A resource owned by a single individual is private. A corporation owned by a small group of stockholders, closely held corporation or close corporation, is a private company. Corporations owned by many shareholders are public companies. Similarly, the state is called the public sector. When the state owns a resource, such as a public park, we sometimes say that the resource belongs to all of the citizens or that it belongs to no one other than the state. What difference does the number of owners make? In discussing the Coase theorem, we described bargaining among the owners of separate properties, such as the rancher and the farmer. Bargaining also occurs when several people own the same property. For example, the partners in a business bargain over the allocation of tasks. The difference between private and public ownership can be described as a difference in the structure of bargaining. Private ownership divides people into small groups. So long as externalities are private, private owners can advance their interests by cooperating with a small number of people. Bargaining among small groups of people tends to result in cooperation and to achieve efficiency. Consequently, the case for private ownership is easy to make when production and utility functions are separable or when externalities affect few people. In these circumstances, public ownership is a costly mistake. An illustration comes from a study of oyster beds along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts of the United States. Superscript 25. See R.J. Agnello and L.P. Donnelly, Property Rights and Efficiency in the Oyster Industry, 18 J. Law and Econ, 521, 1975. See also G. Power, More About Oysters Than You Wanted to Know, 30 MD L. Rev. 99, 1970. Returning to the text, at an early stage in their lives, oysters attach themselves permanently to some subaqueous material, such as rock. This attachment makes it possible to imagine defining property rights in oysters for commercial fishing operators. However, the states along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts that have commercial oyster industries have not settled on a single system of property rights for oysters. Some states have determined that the subaqueous areas where oysters tend to congregate are to be common property for oyster harvesters. Any of them may take oysters from those areas, and none may exclude another. Other states have held that these areas are to be available for private leasing from the state, and the lease will have the usual rights to exclude and transfer with some limitations. This difference allowed Professors Agnello and Donnelly to compare the relative efficiency of the private and communal property rights systems. The measure of efficiency they used was labor productivity, output per person hour in oyster fishing. Their finding was that labor was much more productively employed in the privately leased oyster beds than in the communal oyster beds. Put dramatically, the authors of this study concluded that if all oyster beds had been privately leased in 1969, the average oyster harvester's income would have been 50% higher than it was.